I think in many ways, Europe is the exact opposite of the US in the sense of inflation has moderated considerably. That's what you see in this upper right chart. That moderation of inflation has now brought core and headline inflation basically between 1% and 2%, which is where the ECB's mandate is, their sole mandate. We've seen a significant slowing of economic conditions where we've seen probably 6 months of negative GDP growth. If you take a bottoms up perspective from the underlying data and don't wait for the actual GDP report, that's what it's looking like here in the second half of the year. And yet the amount of easing that's priced in to the European curve is the same exact amount of easing that's priced into the US curve. Now, think about that. You've got two economies that have radically different outcomes. One, which has secularly tight conditions, inflation that is still a bit above what the central bank's mandate is, and growth that's above potential. And it just experienced a huge easing. And you've got another economy where inflation is below the central bank's target and where growth is contracting. Two totally different environments and yet the same pricing. And I think that creates a very interesting opportunity from a diff perspective. The UK is another example of this as well, pricing in basically the same amount of cuts as in the US and as in Europe. I think it falls nicely in between the two, where growth conditions are weaker, but there's still inflationary pressures. And so you have a central bank that in many ways is not even thinking about easing, if you look at what their most recent votes are. And so I think it's another case where the idea that the Bank of England is going to cut anywhere near as much as the ECB over the course of 2024 seems improbable given the set of conditions that are in the UK relative to the set of conditions that are in the Eurozone. Japan, totally different story here. We talked basically 9 months ago, for those of you who follow me on Twitter, about the shift in central bank leadership and whether that would create a significant change in monetary policy. Since then, the Bank of Japan has done a couple of tweaks of their yield curve control measures, but has not significantly shifted their policy stance, which is one that is incredibly easy over time. And if anything, that is increasingly making sense for them to not shift any further, as what we see is that the inflation measures have come down considerably. Over there on the left-hand side is the core inflation, which is printed, in the 1% to 2% range over the course of the last couple of months. We saw the same with the Tokyo CPI number that came out earlier this week, as well as the wage growth numbers, which were printing at 0 year over year. None of that from an inflation perspective suggests an inflation problem or an urgency to tighten. And at the same time, we've seen some moderation in growth, particularly driven by some of the weaker demand circumstances in Asia. And so that's what you see over there on the right-hand side is negative GDP growth, low inflation. This is not an economy where it makes sense to tighten anything. Yet 65 basis points of tightening are priced in to the short end in Japan in 2024. The odds that happen, given the set of conditions, seem very low.